Welcome to Study Time, a televised home learning program produced by Rwanda Education Board.
Hello students, welcome to TV learning programs. I'm teacher Agre, teacher of entrepreneurship. Today I'm going to learn with senior 2 students, Unit 4 markets. The lesson is factors affecting supply. Students of senior 2, do you remember what we studied, what we looked at in the previous lesson about supply? Who can define supply? Who can define supply? What is supply? What is meant by supply? Thank you. Supply refers to the amount of a commodity that producers are willing and able to bring at the market at a given price in a given period of time. That is how we defined supply. Because if producers produce products, they have to bring them to the market to sell them and get a profit. They are supplying goods. That is what we call supply. Now, we have several factors. There are several factors that affect supply. And what makes the supply, what leads to high supply of commodities or what leads to low supply of commodities? We have several factors that can affect supply. And what could be those factors that affect supply? Now, one of the factors that affect supply, there is what we call price of the commodity. Factors affecting supply of a commodity. The first factor is price of the commodity. And when we are explaining these factors, we have to show the positive effect and the negative effect. It is two-sided. Now, the higher the price of the commodity, the higher the price of the commodity, the lower the quantity supplied. The higher the quantity supplied. The higher the quantity supplied. And the lower the price of the commodity, 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 the lower the quantity supplied. The lower the quantity supplied. You remember, according to the law of supply, which states that as the price increases, people are encouraged to supply more goods so that they're able to sell more and get profit. But when prices are reducing, producers are discouraged to supply more goods. Now, this reduces the supply of a given product. Now, the second factor that affects supply, it is the cost of production. The second factor is the cost of production. The cost of production. High costs of production, high costs of production, high costs of production, high costs of production, reduce supply, and low costs of production, 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 low costs of production, increase supply. Increase supply. Increase supply. The cost of production, costs, those are expenses incurred to produce a given product or a given level of output. Those are what we call costs. Now, if the costs of production are high, expenses incurred, like factors of production, because in order to produce goods, we need factors of production. We need labor. In order to produce goods, we need capital. Now, if the cost of labor is high, you may end up employing few workers and you're not able to produce more output, especially when you're using labor-intensive technology. On capital, if the cost of capital is high, the interest rates are high, people will be scared to borrow money from financial institutions to invest in production, which limits production, and the supply would not increase. But if the cost of production are few, this will lead to an increase in supply. The next factor that affects supply, the level of technology. The level of technology. The level of technology. The level of technology. Advanced techniques of production. Advanced techniques of production. Advanced techniques of production. Advanced techniques of production. Increase supply. Increase supply of the commodity. Increase supply of the commodity. While poor techniques of production reduce supply. While poor techniques of production reduce supply. Reduce supply. Learners, technology, those are methods of production used to produce a given level of output. Now, an example, in order to understand this factor, compare two producers, like two farmers. Let me explain in terms of agriculture. Now, compare two farmers. One who is using advanced techniques of production is using a tractor, what we call capital-intensive techniques of production. And another one is using a hoe, which is labor-intensive techniques of production. Now, a farmer who uses a tractor is able to cultivate a large piece of land, and he will produce on a large scale, and is able to produce more and supply more. But a farmer who uses a hoe, that is poor technology, that farmer will cultivate on a small scale, on a small piece of land, who will not be able to produce more output, which leads to a reduction in supply. The next point, natural conditions. Natural conditions. Natural conditions. Favorable natural conditions. Favorable natural conditions. Favorable natural conditions. Favorable natural conditions, like good climate, like good climate, like good climate, like good climate, increases supply. Increases supply. Increases supply of the commodity. Increases supply of the commodity. And unfavorable natural conditions, and unfavorable natural conditions, and unfavorable natural conditions, like drought, reduces supply. Reduce supply. reduce supply. Learners, natural conditions, we are talking about the climate. If the climate is good, there is a favorable climate, a moderate climate. If that climate is favorable, you're able to produce more because the climate is favorable and supply more. But when the climate is unfavorable, the quantity supplied will be low because it will limit production. Like heavy drought will affect what you have produced. Natural conditions affect the supply. That is how it affects the supply of a commodity. The next factor, it is the number of producers. Number of producers. If the number of producers of a commodity increases, supply also increases. Supply also increases. And a reduction in the number of producers reduces supply. And a reduction in the number of producers reduces supply. Reduces supply. The number of producers, how does it affect supply, the number of producers? An example. Now, let's compare two commodities, beans and rice. There are many producers who are producing beans. If there are like 100 producers producing beans, and those who are producing rice, they are only 20. Where will the supply be high, learners? The supply will be high on beans because there are many producers who are producing beans. If there are 100, the number is 100, all of them will produce and bring to the market, which will increase supply. But now when the number is reducing, the quantity supplied will be low. The next factor that affects supply, it is the level of demand. The level of demand. The higher the demand, the higher the demand of a commodity, the higher the demand of a commodity, the higher the demand of a commodity, the higher the quantity supplied. The higher the quantity supplied. The higher the quantity supplied, and the lower the demand. And the lower the demand, the lower the quantity supplied. The lower the demand, the lower the quantity supplied. Lower the quantity supplied. The lower the quantity supplied. The lower the quantity supplied. Learners, you remember about the concept of demand that we looked at in the previous lesson. Who can tell us what is demand? We said that demand is the desire and willingness backed by the ability to buy a product at a given price in a given period of time. Now, the level of demand, take an example. If you have a bakery and you have customers, now the number of customers who need bread, the number is increasing. You will have to produce more bread to satisfy the demand needs of your customers. But now, if the customers are reducing, you can't keep on producing more bread. you have to reduce on the production of bread and produce less. That is how demand affects supply. There are other factors that can affect supply, like the gestation period, the gestation period. This refers to a period of maturity. Like commodities which take long to mature have low supply, unlike those which take a short period to mature. Take an example. If maize takes 3 months, if you grow maize and it can mature in 3 months and supply, you will supply more compared to coffee which takes 5 years. Because when you grow coffee and it takes 5 years to mature, you will produce less. That is the gestation period. Now, we can continue and look at what we call the relationship between demand and supply. The relationship between demand and supply. Learners, who can tell us how are these two variables related? How is demand related to supply? What could be the link between the two variables? What could be the relationship between the two variables? What is the relationship? Now, the relationship between the two variables is that the demand of a commodity, at a given price, affects the supply of such a commodity, When the demand increases, when the demand of a commodity increases, when the demand of a commodity increases, supply also increases. And when the demand decreases, supply for the commodity also reduces. Supply for the commodity also reduces. Which gives a rise to an equilibrium price and quantity, which gives rise to an equilibrium price and quantity, which is determined, rise to an equilibrium price and quantity, which to an equilibrium price and quantity and equilibrium and quantity, which is determined at a point where quantity demanded where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Is equal to quantity supplied. Is equal to quantity supplied, as illustrated below. As illustrated below. As illustrated below. As illustrated below. Now, we are going to illustrate the curve that shows the relationship between demand and supply. Now, this is our curve. Any curve must have an origin. On the vertical, we indicate price. On the horizontal, we indicate the quantity. Now, we have to illustrate the demand curve. And remember, learners, we say that the demand curve slopes downwards from the left to the right. Now, this is our demand curve that is sloping downwards from the left to the right. This is our demand curve. Then, we have the supply curve also. The slope, it moves upwards from the left to the right because of the direct relationship between price and quantity. Now, this is our supply curve. Now, what is the relationship between the two? Now, as the demand increases, supply also increases. As the demand decreases, supply also decreases. Now, what does it mean? It means demand and supply match. They are balancing, which brings what we call price stability. There will be price stability because demand and supply are matching. As demand is increasing, supply is increasing. As demand is reducing, supply is as demand is decreasing, supply is also reducing. Meaning now, demand and supply will match. Demand and supply are matching, which brings what we call an equilibrium price, whereby there will be price stability. Now, how do we determine the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price? Now, we have two curves. This is the demand curve, which slopes downwards from the left to the right. This is our supply curve. And we have said that the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price is determined at a point where the demand and where demand meets the supply curve. Now, this is the demand curve, this is the supply curve. Where do they meet, learners? Who can tell us? Where are they meeting? They are meeting at this point here, which is the point of intersection. Because this is, the point of the intersection is here, where the demand and the supply curve meet. Now, where the demand and supply curve are meeting, we shall now determine the equilibrium quantity, which is determined at the horizontal. Because equilibrium quantity, that is the quantity determined at a point where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal. Now, they are meeting at this point. We shall determine the equilibrium quantity. We determine the equilibrium quantity, which is determined, it has been determined at a point where demand and supply curve meet. Now, where demand and supply meet, we also determine the equilibrium price. Because the equilibrium price, that is a price determined at a point where quantity demanded and quantity supply meet. Now, this is the demand curve, this is our supply curve. They are meeting at this point now. They are meeting at this point. Now, at this point, we shall determine what we call the equilibrium price. We shall determine what we call EP, our equilibrium price. Now, that is the relationship. Now, demand and supply, they are matching until they reach the equilibrium. Because as demand increases, you supply more. But now, if demand is increasing and supply is not increasing, this will bring a disequilibrium. There will be a disequilibrium. Because one is increasing, another variable is not increasing. And the prices will not be stable, they will keep on changing. Because as demand increases, supply does not increase, demand exceeds supply, the prices will increase. And when demand reduces and supply does not reduce, the prices will also, now, prices keep on changing because demand and supply are not equal. But when one is increasing and the other is increasing, there is what we call price stability, that which we call the equilibrium price or the equilibrium quantity. Learners, I want to leave you with the homework. I want to leave you with the homework. This is the homework. The first question is, explain the relationship between demand and supply. I want you to explain the relationship between those two variables, between demand and supply. Now, the second question, use the table below to draw a demand and supply curve on the same graph and use it to determine equilibrium price and quantity. Now, we have three columns. These are different prices. These are different quantities demanded at different prices. This is quantity supplied, the different quantities supplied at different prices. Now, I want you draw the curve, the demand curve and the supply curve, and you determine what will be the equilibrium quantity and what will be the equilibrium price. Remember, learners, the equilibrium quantity is determined at the horizontal, and the equilibrium price is determined at the vertical. And equilibrium price, it is a price determined at a point where demand is equal to supply. Now, you have to look at the quantities and see where is demand equal to supply so that you're able to determine the equilibrium price. And then, what I would like to emphasize on, when you're explaining these factors that affect supply, make sure that you explain two sides. Show an increase, because we want the positive effect and the negative effect. Show an increase in supply, or what leads to high supply, or what leads to low supply. That is what you have to emphasize on. But now, if you explain one side, the approach of the question will be wrong. That shows that you don't understand what the word effect means, or what are the determinants that affect supply. Let me expect learners now, you can be able to explain the relationship between demand and supply. You can even explain the factors that can affect the supply of a given product, and you're able also to illustrate a curve. You're able to illustrate a curve and determine an equilibrium quantity. You're able to illustrate the curve and determine the equilibrium quantity. At the same time, you determine the equilibrium price. And even you can add other points about the factors you can add other points about the factors that can affect supply, and be able to know the difference between equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. So that if you ask the question, differentiate between equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price, you can differentiate about those. Thank you for being attentive, Senior 2 learners, and I wish you a lovely day. Thank you.